Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which is presented by the Preservation of Electronic Government Information Project. I want to thank all of the guests for being here today. I also want to thank the many presenters that we'll be hearing from during this mini forum. My name is Sherry Laster. I'm the head of OpenStack Collections at Arizona State University, and I'm a member of the PEGI Project Steering Committee. I'm not going to go into too much about what the project's working on because I want to spend as much time as we can with our presenters, but just to briefly let you know, the PEGI project is a coordinated group that is working on identifying, documenting, and addressing national concerns regarding the preservation of foreign digital and electronic government information. Today, we've asked some leaders and participants of projects that have been hard at work with collecting preservation policy issues and working with the public to address issues that we share concerns about. We've asked them to join us here today to share their insights into how their projects are accomplishing this work and making a difference. The PEGI project team has developed 3 questions that we use as a framework to gather feedback from communities of library and archive folks, from researchers and teachers, from technologists, analysts, journalists, and the broader public. So at the end of this webinar, we're going to invite all of you to share your thoughts on these 3 questions. So we'll provide this survey link again at the end of this session. For now, we're going to hear from some projects about their work. In the interest of time, I'm going to let each group introduce themselves as we go along. While they're speaking, I hope that you all who are listening will be thinking about questions that can help us tie together some of the themes that come from these remarks. As these questions occur to you, please post them to everyone in the chat box. We may only have time for a few at the end, but the PEGI project team is going to be monitoring the chat box throughout the session, so we'll try to identify some questions for discussion if there's time. And we also anticipate sharing the questions that we're learning from all of you and from these presentations for further public discussion and use. So with that, I am going to hand things off to Rachel.
Okay, hi. My name is Rachel Matson. I am the founder and co-organizer of a group that's sponsored by the Digital Library Federation. It's a group, an interest group in government records, transparency, and accountability. And I'm co-presenting, I was supposed to be co-presenting with Brandon Locke, who is the founder of Endangered Data Week, but he's been called away somewhat appropriately on jury duty today. So he's doing his civic duty, and I'm just going to present his section. He sends his regrets and is with us in spirit. And Brendan and I are hoping that talking about the work of these 2 groups will be helpful in supporting reflection on the broader questions that PEGI seeks to address. So the Digital Library Federation Interest Group on Government Records, Transparency, and Accountability was founded in the winter of 2017, and it seeks to support a broader culture of records transparency in the digital age. We use a variety of methods to provoke wide-ranging consideration of and action related to the creation, accessibility, and preservation of materials created by local, state, and federal governments, including records, publications, information, data, and documents. And the group has monthly open meetings, and over the past year we've sponsored a range of webinars and conference presentations and projects and conversations that are designed to support cross-disciplinary collaboration specifically around improved access to local, state, and federal records and data. There's a lot of things I could say about this work, and I'm not great at very, very, very short, abbreviated presentations. But there are a lot of things I could say about this work and what it's revealed about, for instance, the importance of open, iterative processes in this work, or about the value of cross-disciplinary conversations and collaborations, or I could talk about the ways in which our work has revealed the limitations of the term government information and the difficulty of finding better language to describe the problem we seek to address. And I'm happy to elaborate on all of these areas at a later point, as they do actually bear upon the core questions that PEGI is seeking to address. But I just want to highlight a few categories really briefly of government records, data, and information that have begun to emerge for us as important and useful to think about and with as we consider these questions. So these are some categories that we've been thinking about. Over the past year, we've hosted a variety of open presentations on a range of topics, and these include the 2020 census, federal records transparency and its relationship to immigrant justice, Title 44 reform, FOIA and state-level freedom of information laws, and civic data initiatives. And from these presentations, we've learned about, for instance, the difficulty that immigration attorneys have in accessing government-created documents that are critical to their work representing clients who are being held in immigrant detention centers, and about the ways in which critically important government documents and data can sometimes be released to one person, like a journalist, through the Freedom of Information Act, and then disappear entirely from the information landscape. Among other things, these presentations and conversations have revealed the value of expanding our definition of government information beyond the one that's traditionally used by the FDLP. And certainly there are challenges that the FDLP and the materials covered by its mandate face. But there are also many categories of government data and records that fall outside of the FDLP's mandate that are also at risk and in need of attention. And these include documents obtained by FOIA requests, several categories of court records, and data about activity collected by non-governmental organizations such as civic groups and media outlets. And I want to provocatively suggest here that we should frame the important work that needs to get done to preserve and offer access to born digital government information as broadly as possible, and to look not only at the needs of government publications, but also at categories of data and records that live on the peripheries of what has traditionally been defined among librarians as government info. We'd be very happy to elaborate on any of this in Q&A or at a later date, but in the meanwhile, you can learn more about the work of the DLF Interest Group in Government Records, Transparency, and Accountability, and you can listen to recordings from our webinars at our wiki, which is at wiki.diglib.org/transparency-accountability. Next, I am going to speak a little bit about Endangered Data Week, which is a programming initiative. It's a programming initiative that's coordinated across campuses, libraries, and citizen science initiatives to shed light on public data sets and other government information that is in danger of being deleted, repressed, mishandled, or lost. And the Endangered Data Week project is sponsored by the Digital Library Federation Group in Records, Transparency, and Accountability, and it's aimed at a broad audience that includes, but isn't limited to, information professionals. So Endangered Data Week is trying to develop, broadly speaking, a greater data consciousness, helping people think critically about data collection and use, helping them think more about what government information would be useful to them, and about what formats and avenues that could be useful, and to advocate for themselves in this area. Events relating to Endangered Data Week can promote care for endangered collections by publicizing the availability of data sets, increasing critical engagement with them, talking about visualization and analysis, and encouraging political activism for open data policies and the fostering of data skills through workshops on curation, documentation and discovery, improved access, and preservation. Endangered Data Week started in early 2017 as Data Refuge brought issues of federal data retention into the national headlines, and the project managed to pull together a campaign in a couple of months, thanks largely to the folks at the DLF, and held 57 affiliated events from 30 different sponsors in April 2017. Included Twitter chats, data rescue events, informative workshops, and discussions. And the second annual Endangered Data Week was held this past February and early March, and had 46 affiliated events with 28 different sponsors, and included an attempt to collect stories about open data use, and seemed to have a lot more skills and literacy-based workshops than last year's. So following this year's Endangered Data Week, the four primary organizers of the project, which are Brandon Locke, Sarah Melton, Jason Hepler, and me, we were involved in the Mozilla Open Leaders program. We spent the last several weeks focused on developing the Endangered Data Week Open Curriculum, a collection of workshop ideas, slide decks, and resources accumulated from Endangered Data Week participants over the past 2 years. We've been doing a lot of work to make the resources more accessible, trying to clearly describe what we'd like to have in this toolkit, and trying to make a curriculum a welcoming space for collaboration. And last Thursday and Friday, we participated in the Mozilla Global Sprint, where we spent 2 days working with people from around the world to contribute stories, workshops, and tutorials to the Endangered Data Week Open Curriculum. And you can view these resources and contribute your own at github.com/endangereddataweek/resources. So Endangered Data Week's large overarching goal is to encourage a broad spectrum of people, not just information professionals, but researchers and activists and advocates and teens and young adults, to be more aware of the public data and information that is available to them, to know how to use it for whatever needs they have, and to increase increase access to it. And our events and programming are intended to foster regular conversations about the way that government data has been and continues to be used. And we hope that these regular conversations will do several things with the broader community of public data users. They include generating stories for us to use in advocating for public data, helping information professionals better understand who uses public data and how they use it, create a community of users and curators, and finally generate media attention on the social, technical, and political threats to inform an even broader community. So that's it for me. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you. And next up, we have Bernard Riley from the Center for Research Libraries.
I'm going to be extremely economic with my use of slides. I have only 2 slides for the presentation. CRL is an organization that is focused on ensuring the long-term survival and accessibility of important primary data and documentation for research. We've been doing that for about 70 years. That documentation ranges from archives of records of political trials by governments in various parts of the world to anti-government propaganda, anti-government materials produced in turbulent areas. I've been asked to answer 3 questions. What are the categories of born digital government information that have long-term value for research purposes? Material relating to the surveillance is particularly important and endangered, it seems to me, and will be important for the longer term. This is a realm in which the volumes of data produced are challenging the government's own capability for preservation and providing long-term access to material. Police body camera data collected through surveillance by literally hundreds of jurisdictions across the United States is creating important evidence that's immediately important for purposes of litigation, for purposes of legal bringing legal responsibility and accountability. That material is particularly important and that material will in the end become extremely important for historians who are trying to reconstruct events of today. That data is really something that the local jurisdictions, the police departments that have adopted body cameras, it's been very challenging for them to be able to manage that data. A great deal of the management of it, in fact, is being outsourced to commercial organizations that specialize in security, security business, and also in the security technology. The Bumble Hive, the National Security Archives data center in the desert in Utah. What's important about the National Security Archive data that's being collected is not only the scale of it, but it's the potential danger of that data never coming to light or never being made available to the stakeholders who have an interest in that. The scale of the data is, as I said, extremely important, extremely significant. One can't imagine a scenario in which those important records of government activity, U.S. government activity, are actually turned over to an organization like the National Archives for long-term preservation. The other challenge for that kind of data is that the other thing that creates risk to it is that the sensitivity of that data. Obviously, the data invades the privacy or threatens the privacy of millions of people throughout the United States and throughout the world. And so that data, the declassification process for that data is going to be very important for. It will be very important that process that decides which data will be made available to the public or even preserved for the long term, that process is monitored by the stakeholders. outsourcing, I think, is a big issue here as well, because this is a scale of data that I'm not sure that the current apparatus that the government has for the long-term management of data is going to be able to manage this material. The U.S. government has already had experience with commercial providers of data hosting and other data services that have gone south, and so the relationship between what's actually maintained by government agencies themselves and what's being maintained for them by third parties is something that needs a fair amount of daylight, and that's will be important. That information, that not only the data collected by the organizations like the surveillance organizations like National Security Agency, the data itself is important, but the data about that data is going to be probably equally important for the writing of history in the long term. What did the government know about individuals? What kinds of data was collected? Is there so the question that begs is that what kind of provisions are being made for the preservation of metadata about the data collected by organizations, government agencies like National Security Agency? So in terms of strategies, 3, audits. Number 1, audits. Intense, independent, and ongoing oversight of and analysis of what information the government is producing and gathering is going to be important for the real stakeholders. And that auditing, the intense and independent auditing, has to really be focused on and be aware of the interests of the real stakeholders. Who is it that's really going to be, that we're really representing as libraries? Second, forensic knowledge. We really need a lot more more knowledge about how digital data is produced, managed, and processed in the field itself. That seems to be an enormous blind spot for us. Third, support the daylight organizations out there, the organizations that are lodging the FOIA requests and the forcing disclosure of documentation and data, sensitive documentation and data from the government agencies. Those operations exist on the national level, like the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., on the international level, like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and even on the local level, like the Chicago Police Data Project. As Rachel Matson's excellent presentation suggested, these are organizations that the FOIA requests are disclosing enormous amounts of information. That information needs to be preserved. A lot of the organizations that are disclosing that information and data are operating on a shoestring, so I think we need to bring direct support from the academic community to those agencies. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Next up, we have Justin Schell, who's speaking about the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. Justin, take it away.
Cool. Thanks, Shari. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and thanks for having me. So I've been a member of PEGI for, I don't know, a year and a half now, ever since we got together in Philly for one of the early data rescue events. Seems like so long ago. But those initial events and the work and the issues that came out of them have really motivated a lot of the other work that I've done, both within PEGI as well as being sort of like a liaison, conductor, go-between between a lot of different groups and people working on this project. This very large project of ensuring the preservation and access of federal information. I don't have any slides beyond that one, but I'll talk about a few different things with those 3 questions. And one of the things that we came across very early on, and also learned from others who've been working in this field for a long time, is what is most important or what has the most long-term value depends on who you talk to. We had researchers here at Michigan at the University of Michigan, when we were talking about putting on a data rescue event here, saying, that one satellite, like that's my career. Make sure that information is available. And that gets into hierarchies around responsiveness to specific faculty at an institution and how much they could determine the resources that are deployed for a certain task or a certain sort of project. But then we also have, as I think Rachel mentioned as well, all these different groups who are using this kind of data, and from end users to federal data managers, activists, and sort of everyone having some piece of the elephant, that no one, I don't think anyone really has a handle on all of the different kind of uses. But something that we've been working on in PEGI has been to move on a number of different fronts, building upon the work of those initial data rescue events, and for me, keeping that sort of intensity of those, because even though we haven't seen data loss in the same way that we were worried about, there still is lots of stuff that's either going away for very pedestrian reasons, through conventional bit rot or metadata discrepancies. Someone has it on a hard drive after a FOIA request and then loses the hard drive. I think also just the sort of hitting the wall of all of the different sort of issues and challenges within this larger field and these kinds of tasks. So within PEGI, we've worked on a few different things. One has been the Data Together project, which builds out of a few different things we were working on with the data rescue events, but basically tries to build a preservation and access structure around a different kind of internet called IPFS, and which has cryptographic hashes and those kinds of methods at the core of it, and so we would know the provenance quite well, because if anything changed, it will be represented within that hash, which is something that we struggled with, which is knowing, is this the authentic data set, which gets into questions of provenance and veracity and where'd you get this from and things like that. And so it tries to get at the root of that from the beginning. But we also need to agree upon what a data set what would make it authentic. So another one has been, in a different vein, the website monitoring work that we've done, which is where we have around 30 to 35 volunteers who are going over hundreds of changes to websites, to federal websites, for looking at specific changes for removals around climate change or climate or alternative energy. And you can see this on PEGI's website, and you can volunteer if you'd like. We are always looking for new volunteers. So ranging, and the software allows us to track changes from the most minute, from someone went over, it seems like, the entire EPA site and corrected a crooked apostrophe to a straight apostrophe, up to wholesale climate change page removals, removals of reports, and things like that. And so what we do is we will we'll look at that, we'll categorize and sort of aggregate all these results, put them into reports that document with Internet Archive Wayback Machine links, descriptions of the changes and things like that. Put those out to a pool of journalists that we've worked with over the past year, who then go to the agency in question and say, hey, what's going on? And sometimes the stuff has gone back up. Sometimes they've given wishy-washy answers. Sometimes they haven't responded at all. But I think this is part of that larger sort of documentation effort within the this might seem more like short term, but this aggregates into these longer term picture of what's happening on federal web pages with this kind of work. As I mentioned before, this this sort of imperative that we were feeling back in the data rescue event days is something that, in working with a lot of end user groups, they still feel. They're worried about where this thing will live. They have a bunch of PDFs on their hard drives that are really important to their work. And so how to better, preserve those materials. And so one project that we're going to work on here at the Design Lab, and that's we're working on getting some more funding for it to do it a little bit broader, would be a pilot with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals or Climate Adaptation Professionals, and which is about 100 different or so climate adaptation groups here in the U.S., and working with those end users of different information. And so these could be large clearinghouses like CAKE, the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Ecosystem, or the Georgetown Climate Adaptation Clearinghouse, and making sure all of their documents and PDFs and things that they use are backed up in something like the Internet Archive, or have a preservation plan in place, or looking at something where we can look at a data set and better understand and work with federal data managers, publishers, things like that. Like, okay, well, this is something that also has a preservation plan in place beforehand. So even if it would go down off of this site, that's something that we know that it exists someplace else too. And so this is working from a more bottom-up approach, where people who were concerned about things, helping to sort of demystify the preservation and access process. Because I think one of the things that has come to light in a number of different meetings we've had around this project, whether it be things at PEGI, the Libraries Plus, with EGI and others, was the sort of the invisibility of the infrastructure and the invisibility of the groups who are actively work every day to do the work of making this stuff available and keeping it available. That is totally not as sexy as downloading a bunch of data sets at a one-day event. And so being able to greater connect these different groups to better understand this and make sure that there's a better understanding all around of both how things are made, how things are preserved, and how things are used. So that's one thing we'll be looking at with the group, with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and specifically within them, the Science to Action community. If people want more information about either of those things, I can share that in the chat or afterwards. But one of the things that we've also seen is just people. Last year was a moment where so many people who didn't normally talk to each other were talking to each other, and I think that's also what keeps me and keeps a lot of us going, is like, okay, we need to make sure that those conversations continue, and that there are these smaller or larger projects, but that we're continually talking to and leaning on our colleagues in different parts of the field to make them successful. So I'll stop there, but happy to answer questions later on, and looking forward to hearing what my other colleagues have to say and what you all have to say afterwards. Thanks.
Next, we're gonna have Bethany Wiggin and Patricia Kim from the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities.
Thanks, Sherry. This is Bethany speaking, and I'm going to introduce myself briefly, and then Patricia's going to introduce herself briefly, and we're going to I'll walk you quickly through 13 slides that we made for you, most of which are photos, so don't be too overwhelmed. At the University of Pennsylvania, I direct the program in Environmental Humanities, and beginning in November of 2016, student fellows in that program started thinking about a joint collaboration that we could do with a variety of partners to draw attention to the ways that climate deniers could endanger existing data, as well as certainly endanger the creation of future climate and environmental data. You have heard Rachel and Justin talk more eloquently than I can about the Data Refuge Project and the data rescue events that we help to organize. So I won't continue to talk about that, other than to say that a number of the words that I have heard the three preceding webinars, the presentations give today are very resonant with what Patricia and I are going to talk about in terms of care, and the fact that data really requires care, and that for people to care about it, the connections that data makes between people, places, and non-human species are at the heart of the project. Beginning in February or January or February of 2017, so in the early days of data rescue events, we at Penn started thinking really carefully about longer-term advocacy projects that we felt as environmental humanists that we could really contribute to with our own set of skills. And for that reason, we founded data storytelling, a suite of initiatives, and we began trying to shine the light on some of those things that Justin described as less sexy, so the sort of everyday infrastructure, the everyday work of people who generate data but who also care for it. The storytelling project has received a grant from the National Geographic Foundation, and it's this set of data storytelling tools and public engagements that we're going to talk to you about in what follows. So we need the next slide, please. As you can see here, the project is organized by a catalog, which was a data catalog generated by data rescue events, and then the blue and the yellow boxes highlight what's happening in the Data Stories Initiative, in which we set ourselves this challenge to imagine data as alive. And if data were alive, who would be the various people who took care of it? If you were to tell a story about a data asset as an obituary, what would that look like? If it were a birth announcement, what would that look like? These are things we've been prototyping across 3 phases of the data storytelling project. And over to Patricia.
Hi everyone, this is Patricia Kim. I'm a PhD candidate here at Penn in Art History. I was a former EH fellow, very much involved with the beginning stages of the Data Refuge Project, and also one of the co-recipients of the National Geographic grant that we received, along with Tad Shore here at Penn, Denise Ruff at New America, as well as the Office of Sustainability, or the Sustainability Director, as well as Bethany Wiggin, who we just heard from, who is the PI. And I'll just briefly go over the 3 different phases that Bethany mentioned, and I'd just like to quote what Rachel said about creating a culture of data consciousness, because that's something that didn't really occur to me, those words exactly, but I think that's something that we've been really doing over the past several months. So as you can see in the first box under phase 1, we've been prototyping different storytelling tools, as well as participating in and hosting different public engagement events around the city of Philadelphia, as well as in some other cities at different major conferences that I'll go over in just a minute. Well, actually, I'll go over now. These conference storytelling tools for researchers, we've been to the American Geophysical Union conference in New Orleans, as well as a conference on digital media at the New Museum in New York City, where we've engaged different researchers who produce and consume data. We've had different storytelling events for college-age students across Penn's campus, where we ask students what kind of data they use, as well as the data that they wish they had more information about. And we've also been to different kinds of public events, such as the Philadelphia Science Festival, where we asked children of all ages to start thinking about what data is, and we've engaged their parents as well, asking them, asking them about the data that they wish they had in their hometown of Philadelphia. So as you can see, a variety of different kinds of tools and templates. We've now wrapped up the first phase of prototyping here in Philly, and we're beginning to sort of scale this project nationally, where we will ask different teams
5 different storytelling teams from different regions around the nation, as well as journalists and artists, to help us continue to build this story bank, to continue to contribute to this repository. And then finally, our third phase culminates in Washington, D.C. at the National Geographic headquarters, where we will have a 2-day conference where artists, civic data folks, journalists, and the different teams to come and have conversations around these tools and these stories and the way in which we can further create, again, as Rachel said, this culture of data consciousness, which I love. And so as you can see, we have these different tools, and I'll just hand it back over to Bethany to kind of go over more specifically what we've developed.
Thanks. So we were really thrilled when PEGI asked us to participate in the webinar because we have a specific ask of PEGI and of the people who are listening in either now or later, and that is to help us as we pivot from phase 1 to phase 2. In phase 2, beginning in June, we'll be circulating a call for applications. In effect, what we decided to do with the money from the National Geographic is to re-grant it. And the idea is that there are 3 different sort of channels that we want to distribute this, these funds through. We would like to seed 5 teams of storytellers across the country. We are commissioning 2 original art pieces about data stories, and we're commissioning 5 data journalists. The idea behind this is that each of these teams will be able to use the storytelling tools that we've piloted and prototyped here in Philadelphia, whether at the Science Festival or on campus or with our libraries, and continue to refine and adapt them to feed into this data story bank that we are creating that you see a little mock-up of here. It's a very pretty low-tech Omeka platform that we have people identify their local community on a map and can contribute a variety of different data stories about how federal data is used in their town to address specific challenges that are relevant in their locale. Ideally, we're looking for 5 fairly distinct geographic regions that are dealing with different types of climate and environmental challenges. We think that the successful team applications will probably have some kind of affiliation with a library. We imagine that to be a really important sort of catalyst for components. That's certainly been our experience here at Penn, where the library is an incredibly important partner for us. We imagine that another important collaborative node is the civic tech communities in a variety of towns, as well as cities and towns' sustainability directors. And because we are scaling this project not only through PEGI and the libraries community, but through the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, we're hoping to get a good degree of visibility there. Vital to this storytelling project has also been the Union of Concerned Scientists, who have been helping us to develop relationships with their science network, and through that we hope the project will also get a high degree of visibility. As we move towards the calls will begin to circulate in June. The fellows and various collaborative teams and artists will be selected by September 1st. And then each regional storytelling team will add more data stories to this national story bank. Artists will be invited to visualize what's going on in the story bank, and all of this will be presented at National Geographic. National Geographic has the sort of the rights to the stories that are developed through whatever happens at National Geographic, which sounds somewhat ominous, but then may also mean that the National Geographic magazines will be publishing stories about
the data refuge stories. So there's a variety of publication plans in the offing, including more scholarly productions about the lives of data that we will create at Penn. And I think with that, we're probably going to, I think we're done our more formal piece, and we look forward to your questions and the conversation.
Up next, I would very much like to welcome and thank Heather Joseph for joining us today. So Heather, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much to the PEGI organizers for all the great work you're doing, and also for including Spark in today's conversation. I don't have formal slides that are uploaded, so you'll just be hearing me and looking at this beautiful slide. I've got the 3 questions that were asked, and I'm going to take my 8 or so minutes really to focus on the 3rd question. Spark is a catalyst for action, so we really like to spend time talking about things that we can do to move the needle forward. As you can see on the slide, our reason for being is to make open the default in research and education. Essentially what we'd like to see is the mode of operating change, and have folks in the research and educational environment expect to share the results of their research and the materials that they use to teach, unless or until there's a compelling reason to shut them down. And for the purposes of this particular conversation, the research output that we're focusing on in the PEGI context is really research data, the data resulting from research. And we think that open data writ large, particularly publicly funded data, is foundational for achieving all of the good things that we as an organization representing the library community want to see happen: discovery, innovation, and informed citizenry, all kinds of good outcomes. So it's something that we focus on for work that's central to our organization. However, of course, as we know, that the big challenge right now that we're facing is that under the current administration, with the change in the last presidential election, there's a real sense that an empirical, data-driven, fact-based operating mode is, frankly, an endangered way of operating. And for us, the lever that we've looked at where we can help contribute to ensuring that research data continues to be made openly accessible, not just for us, but for generations to come, is to look at using policy and the policy environment as a way to make change. So in the context of Spark as an advocacy organization for open research data, working as individual organizations, libraries and institutions collectively as Spark as an organization, and then Spark in partnership with larger coalitions, we're looking at public data equaling endangered data. So what actions can we take? What are the kinds of strategies that we think we can work on, again, individually and collectively to move the needle in the policy environment? And of course, first and foremost, the minute you think about something being endangered or a policy environment where something's under threat, there's four areas that I want to concentrate on. The first is you go into defense mode, right? And that's fine. And that is one of our primary strategies and one of the opportunities and things we need to be focusing on is playing active, pragmatic defense. So we really upped our game as an individual organization with a presence in DC, but also using our membership in larger coalitions to be much more active about scanning the policy landscape for places where either regulations or legislation may be coming into play that can further limit or shut down our ability to have an open access to publicly funded research data right now and or in the future. And certainly you can, we're enormous fans of the data refuge projects that were just described, right? Those responses to things like the EPA in particular, their data being threatened with being taken down off of websites, climate change data, other sensitive data in general. Those are great reactions in terms of community action to respond to those threats. But we're also trying to look at places where the actions may not be quite so overt. It may just be a line in a bill that says this data will no longer be made available. So covering that landscape in terms of defense is one of the strategies. And we really are looking at that as an all-hands-on-deck kind of a strategy and working with as wide a pack of collaborating organizations to try to keep that defense mechanism going. But we never want to be only in a defensive mode. So I would say the second piece and the largest piece of strategy and action that we're really pushing on in the policy environment is to recognize that progress is actually still possible, and actively positioning ourselves to drive proactive policies to ensure current access to publicly funded research data and permanent access to that data as well. It's really interesting if you think about, despite the turmoil and the unsettled nature of the current policy environment, there's one characteristic that stands out in contrast, and that's that we have single-party control. The Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the executive branch, right, the White House at this moment. And that's a weird trifecta that actually presents opportunity to move legislation. I know it feels weird to think about that, but it actually is sort of an alignment of the stars that we've looked at to say this gives us a smoother path to get legislation through that could potentially be foundational and helpful. So in particular, we've focused on, along with our coalition partners and collaborating organizations, advocating for passage of things like the Open Government Data Act, which has made it through the Senate and is poised to be acted upon by the House, and which the White House has indicated they will sign if it passes, making open and machine readable the default mode for all government data, right? And that it includes, by definition, as a subset, open research data. So really pushing for proactive legislation passing, given the fact that we have an opportunity to do that, might seem like it's not possible in this environment, but it actually is It actually is possible. Additionally, that was legislation that had started moving prior to the change in this administration. We're delighted that we were able, with our partners, to really continue to keep that moving. And part of how that happens is we've worked hard to try to understand what the policy priorities are for this particular administration and regime in Congress. And we've had to recognize that we need to change the way that we're talking about legislation. It may be the same piece, but whereas open and transparent were big buzzwords and big priorities for the Obama administration, they're not so big for this administration. However, taxpayers, good deals for taxpayers, big wins for taxpayers are things that are important to this administration. And in many cases, simply changing the language that we're using to talk about the aims of the same piece of legislation has allowed us to make progress towards driving for the goals that we want to drive towards. We're trying to position open data, access to research data, data sharing, taxpayer access to data as an enabling strategy in order to help the current leadership in Congress achieve their goals, the current administration achieve policy goals that we share. One example that I can give you of this may seem a little odd, like, well, how do you do that? Is we actually are, along with the Open Government Data Act, actively advocating as a library membership organization for the Financial Transparency Act in the House of Representatives. And this is a piece of legislation that has at its core making financial reporting data open and machine readable to make it easier for potential investors to use text and data mining, computational techniques to mine these reports and these data to find investment opportunities, right, to fuel the economy. Those are aims that the sponsors of the legislation in Congress dearly support. They're aims that the current administration supports, and they're aims that we support, and we also support the techniques, right? Text data mining, open data, computable, machine-readable, standardized data in order for us to achieve our aims. So we're advocating for the financial transparency report, and then we're talking to every single office, every single policymaker at the same time about, if you like these kinds of techniques on financial data, you're going to love it when they're applied to scientific research data. You know, in the financial environment, the goals are economic growth and, you know, innovation and investment. There are also economic development and growth in the scientific environment, but it's also better health, faster cures, you know, all the kinds of things we can point to that are outcomes that are near and dear to our heart. So really trying to broaden the way that we work and the kinds of things that we're supportive of, if they have in the policy environment, if they have elements that will work for us in the research data environment, we're trying to be proactive about finding them, identifying them, and vocally supporting them, and drawing the corollaries between supporting openness and data in those environments and the importance of openness and data in the environment that we are operating in. The third thing that we're doing, the third strategy, kind of builds on this notion of getting out of our comfort zone and finding corollaries to research data in places that are meaningful to policymakers in this environment, and that's building strong and stronger cross-sector relationships to leverage those discussions. So we joined, for example, the Data Coalition, which is the world's only trade association that's dedicated to the transformation of government information into standardized open data. They don't really focus on scientific data. They're focusing more on sort of operational data, financial data, legislative data, regulations, but research data fits in under that umbrella, and finding ways to work and be an active member of that coalition has helped us build our sort of strength in numbers approach, and also the recognition of the importance of research data as an important subset in this larger milieu. So loads of opportunities to kind of collectively, individually and collectively advance the aims of PEGI and of our community through these kinds of opportunities. And finally, the fourth thing that we're doing, the fourth strategy that we're very action-oriented and invite folks to think about also participating in, is even though the data that a lot of the data that we're talking about protecting or making open and locking down in an open way is publicly funded data, influencing the public funders in terms of policy isn't the only game in town. And it's really important to also work with highly visible and highly influential private funders and foundations who invest in work that produce huge amounts of data in their own right, and talk with them and encourage them to put policies in place that emphasize the importance of the immediate and permanent access to research data. Really, the strategy is working with private foundations and large private research funders to serve as exemplars so that we can point then to them when we're talking with public policy makers and say, hey, you know, this is the direction the Gates Foundation, for example, is going in with their, you know, $10 billion a year investment in research, similar to what you're investing in HHS and the Department of Ed. So really looking at a way to organize research funders. We're convening a group called the Open Research Funders Group, helping to make sure that they stay educated on the importance of open policies and then pointing back as exemplars. For us, really proactive policy work is key in this environment, and that is where we're focusing, and we invite all members of the PEGI community to work with us on that. So I will stop there, and if there's any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Heather. And that actually brings us to the question portion. So I realize we're about at time, but for those of you who are able to stick around for a few minutes, maybe we could have at least one group question discussion. I'm going to hand the mic over to Scott Matheson, who will handle the question session. And for those who have to leave, this recording will be made available on the PEGI website, so please come back and check in with us later. So Scott, take it away.
Okay, great, thanks. We had one question early on. We had sort of a discussion about environmental impact statements when that came up early on in the discussion. There was some good back and forth in the chat. But I think the first thing that I saw that is sort of a question that we could have everyone chime in on is Cindy Etkin posted on behalf of Cindy members, and that's a consortium of government agency, information agencies. Please ask the presenters for their perspective on a connection between the PEGI project and the FDLP Modernization Act of 2018. And just in case folks aren't sure about that, we've had two different pieces of legislation discussed here, but the FDLP Modernization Act is H.R. 5305. And it has some of the things, some new definitions in it, and that's one of the things that we heard about as well as the definition of government information. It has a large definition sections, including definitions of the term federal information to mean information created, collected, processed, maintained, disseminated, disclosed, or disposed of by the federal government in any medium or form. So that disclosed there would pick up your FOIA issues that we talked about potentially. And there's some other great definitions in there as well. But I just wanted to bounce this back to the presenters and see if they have specific thoughts on how the work that we're all doing, that you're all doing, and that PEGI is trying to catalog, how does that fit in with changes to GPO's mandate or even changes to our open Government Data Act that Heather mentioned? And so maybe we should start with Rachel.
I was hoping you wouldn't call on me. It's such a huge question, and I don't have a really easy answer to it. I think the work that the Digital Library Federation Interest Group on Government Records Transparency and Accountability has been doing has really just been to frame conversations as broadly as possible about the kind of reforms to Title 44 and the modernization of that work that's happening in Congress, to try to frame those conversations as broadly as possible so that we can engage as many people who, in a lot of ways there's a lot of people who don't identify as so-called government information librarians who actually do not only manage and support the preservation and access to government documents. I can't remember. So there's a lot of people who do this work who don't identify as government information librarians and who aren't involved in the conversations around Title 44 and its reform. And so for us, it has been really important to try to involve those people in these conversations so that the work isn't kind of inward-looking, but outward-looking. And I know that James Jacobs and Jim Jacobs of freegovinfo.info have had some really interesting things to say about the limitations and the kind of focus of the reform that has happened, which has been sort of to reduce costs. And that's a problematic way to think about it, that in a born digital moment that we really have to think about a robust preservation strategy and a robust access strategy and funding for that, and really funding that robustly. So it's not a great answer to the question, but I just think that the conversation has to be conducted as broadly as possible.
Okay, great, thank you. I think Bernie is next. Thoughts on this, Bernie, or how you see CRL's mission kind of, does this help? Would you like to see more motion on open access mandates and making that data computable, that sort of thing?
The government, both the GPO and the NAR and the National Archives and Records Administration are under-resourced for dealing with the kinds of documentation and data that's being produced by the government on the scale that it's being produced. And I think I think the more we understand about that, the more we know we'll know where the private sector where the non-public sector can step in and help. One of the solutions I offered was a kind of a radical growing of the capabilities in libraries for auditing and forensic analysis of documentation and data and the systems that are used to manage and maintain that data. I think those systems are themselves are at risk. Things like the GPO's apparatus for digital repository for digital government information, and even the National Archives Electronic Records Archive, which are its capabilities are trying to keep up with the pace of the evolution of kinds of data and documentation being gathered and produced by government, but it's with the resources available in National Archives, it's not really able to. I think also there's a lot of this data, even aside from the scientific data, and we at CRL don't do much with scientific data, but the public policy data and the public record information that we see at risk, I think a lot of that is really going to be extremely important to academic researchers in the long term. So the challenge to me seems to be, and CRL exploring this and working on this, is how do we get more direct support from academia, from the universities, to the organizations that are maintaining data that will be vital to research activity in academia in the future.
Okay, excellent. I know Justin had to leave us promptly, but it sounds to me like maybe some of what he was talking about in terms of auditing and having a file, a distributed file system across the network that could track these sort of things, the work that PEGI is doing now, seems like that might be a way to help some of that provenance, some of those provenance issues, and work with make some of that data easier to work with, even in a distributed fashion. All right, that brings us to the folks at Penn. Sounds like maybe storytelling and tools could help us not only get legislation moving, but also maybe discuss ways to make sure that we protect the data that's already there and the data collection going forward.
That's very much the idea. I don't know that I would add a word to what you just said, but that's certainly the reason also why we decided to go with the National Geographic Foundation as a project partner, because it reaches the kind of broad audience where we feel that there is a lot of data literacy work that needs to be done. So we have really been trying to think about ways to translate why there should be political will to not just to archive data in a cost-cutting way, but to actually provide more robust archiving measures. I also want to echo and come back to something that Heather said when she was talking about the Open Government Data Act, and I do actually think that proactive legislation is in fact possible even in this environment. But I think the need to translate and to make data come alive is probably the biggest challenge that we face. Certainly as we've been developing storytelling tools to do just that, some of them don't work very well, and the stories still remain really boring. So we really have been refining to come up with good ways of telling the story about what federal data does on local scales. And it's not easy, but it is actually immensely rewarding when it's successful, and I think is then scalable across different sites.
Okay, excellent. It seems like there was a lot of traction around Rachel's term of data consciousness, as opposed to more in-depth data literacy. It seems like this data consciousness, just being aware of the data that's out there or how the data is used, really seems like one of our kind of first steps for everyone. And it seems like maybe, Heather, just to bring it back to you, that's sort of what Spark is working towards on the sort of political level of trying to convince policymakers that this sort of data is important and that we need to be able to use it in modern ways. There is actually text and data mining language in the FDLP bill that Cindy had originally asked about, but go ahead.
Which is great, right? So repeating language, right, underscores its importance. People start, it's really literally sometimes as simple as, oh, I saw that. I've seen that phrase before. It must mean something. That's important. So yeah, text and data mining, calling it out is an important thing. But building on the Penn folks' storytelling, that one of the things that we're finding is really important in terms of the story that the current sort of regime responds to is return on investment. And so, you know, while I would say the active demonstrations of this data was made open and here was this great outcome in terms of a sort of a personal story, those are important. But the bent of the folks here, you tend to get their attention a little bit more quickly and keep it longer if you can talk about, we invested X amount of dollars in collecting this data set, and after it was analyzed and put into use, there was X amount of return, right? It's really sometimes that straight line that holds the attention at this point. And, you know, we can't be afraid to try to speak that language and say, we know the data is valuable, and if you want a number, there are ways that we can put a number on it.
Great, and so it seems like, you know, to build on the open access mandates, we could actually start moving towards making sure that we include the data in that as well, or the computable information. So perfect.
Absolutely.
All right, so I just wanted to clarify, Rachel corrected me, said that data consciousness is Brandon Locke's term, so we'll give credit to him. And Bethany says that they're using data ecology, which ties back into the statements they were making about telling stories about data as if it was a living thing, as if it actually changes over time and needs care over time, which we all know it does. So it's a great analogy, metaphor, I guess. And she says how data not only emerges from our environments but also shapes them. So that's another great way to talk to our folks about data. I'm going to turn it back over to Sherry because I know we're over time and we do want to wrap up and just put a little bow on the webinar for everyone and thank everyone for attending. Sherry?
Thank you, Scott. There is no bow that I could put on that would be as eloquent as you are. So I just want to once again thank all of the presenters and participants, including Rachel Mattson and Brandon Locke, Bernard Briley, Justin Schell, Bethany Wiggin, Patricia Kim, and Heather Joseph. We're very grateful for the time you took to talk about your work and to help us better connect what you're doing with the vision and the work that we want to accomplish in collaboration with you. So this recording will be available later, and we will be taking extensive notes on both what we're learning today and how we can bring this together for our work going forward. For those who have not yet filled out PEGI's 3-question survey, Deborah shared the URL. It's also up on this slide, so we ask that if you're interested in this, you're welcome to connect with us that way. And thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Have a great week.